Greetings, everyone, and happy Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, the Filipinx Administrative Leaders in Higher Education, Untapped Narratives into Diverse Leadership Approaches. Just a couple of housekeeping items while everybody gets settled. We are using the Zoom webinar platform for today's webinar, and so your mics and cameras are disabled by default. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, please use the chat function and select all panelists, and we will work with you directly to sort it out. If at any time during the webinar you have questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A function. Please note that we will be holding questions until after the presentation. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Tricia Ryan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I am Tricia Ryan. I currently serve as the chair for the Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus at AACRAO. I also am representing San Jose State University. I serve as the director there for graduate admissions and program evaluations. I'm going to go ahead and commence sharing my slides here. Okay. So the reason why I am offering this webinar is I recently finished my EDD program. So my doctorate degree in education, concentration in educational leadership. And I've had the privilege to join this program at my campus at San Jose State University. We're a state university, and we're offered some really awesome privileges to participate in graduate programs. So I did that, approaching middle age. When I entered the program 3 years ago, I was a single mom. We all know that administrative work at the university level is very heavy laden. And so trying to complete a doctoral level program while working full-time, taking care of a family is a very challenging job, very challenging to approach. However, I really felt a need to sort of be trained and expose myself to terminology that can help articulate some of the experiences I have been through and also witness through leadership in higher education, specifically leaders of color navigating higher educational spaces. And so the topic of my dissertation study was Filipinx Administrative Leaders in Higher Education. This is a little bit of a different title from my study, but essentially they're unheard narratives about diverse leadership approaches. You heard a little bit about me. If you have more questions about that, you can ask me at the end of the webinar. But perhaps I should give a little bit more context about my own history before pursuing this type of qualitative study. I was born in the Philippines way back when, and immigrated here when I was just a little baby, youngest of 4. Immigrated to Oakland, California, and really was thrust into 2 cultures, right? At home, it was Filipino culture. Entering school, it was entirely new. So I grew up with sort of a split understanding of how my environment sort of operated. And at home, my own understanding was, I was to go out there and basically disrobe who I am as Filipino, and as a child, a very young child, not knowing very well what that means, but going out there with the understanding from my parents handing down to me to embrace what we term as American culture. That's a little bit about my background. This slide here is basically an introduction to the study. So I did conduct qualitative research. Qualitative research mainly in the vein of phenomenology. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But I'm essentially responding to what's been largely documented as a phenomenon of invisibility experienced by Filipinx Americans specifically. This theme of invisibility as well is in the research literature as ascribed to also the experience of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders at large. My study also attempts to create a space for delving deeper into diverse approaches to educational leadership in higher education. I do have a set of data, but the data essentially shares that the majority, more than 80% of senior leadership positions in US higher education are taken up by white counterparts, whereas the remainder of that percentage, less than 20%, are taken up by people of color. And so promoting inclusivity was really important for me, inclusivity of diverse leaders, and also those leaders that occupy really the margins of higher education, and most likely the margins of K through 12 education when growing up. So some of the themes, some of the theoretical background that we're asked to do as doctoral students is, if you're going to do a study, you need to have some kind of conceptual framework to go with. And so I went with a mixture of conceptual frameworks. And the reason being is because the type of study I've done, well, it's not entirely new. It's very sparsely investigated within higher educational research. So I sort of mixed in the theory of anti-oppressive education alongside subaltern studies, and then a review of Filipino colonial and post-colonial history and research. But a little bit of a word about anti-oppressive education, especially in this age that we're in, shifting the culture of higher ed to be more inclusive. Anti-oppressive education is a popular theory, but not quite like CRT or intersectionality. Anti-oppressive education mainly focuses on ideas like what does education for the quote other look like? Education about the other, education that is critical of privileging and othering. How does that happen within our institutions? And also education that changes students and society. There's a whole host of juicy information when it comes to anti-oppressive educational theory. But what it does, it's a very open theory that allows for culturally relevant theories to be paired up with it. So when thinking about the Filipinx historical circumstance, I really lean towards subaltern studies. If you haven't heard of subaltern studies, it's a very large arena of study that essentially talks about and points towards those voiceless portions of society. Now you may be thinking, well, that could be very many groups, and that is very true. What I liked about subaltern studies is that it gave a focus on ethnic groups that have been colonized. And so for Filipinx Americans, we have sort of a double colonization of history, over 300 years of colonization from Spain, immediately followed by US occupation in the early 20th century. So I go over all of this in my study, mostly to provide a really rich context for my current study. Okay, so we went over some of the definitions of subaltern, but I'll do that again here. Subaltern, this is a really succinct definition: the oppressed and voiceless portions of society who remain unheard. If you need another example of this, a good one is what's going on between the state of Palestine and Israel. And so when you're looking at an oppressive dynamic, power dynamic like that, you have to ask yourself, which portions of that society, which group of people remain voiceless, even through revolt, remain voiceless? Those are the subaltern. Subalternity, the ontological condition of oppression brought about by colonization or other forms of power and cultural dominance, being on the margins of society while always being subject to the activities of ruling groups, even at times of rising up or revolution. So subalternity are sort of like the wake or the trail, you know, the wake of a boat, the trail of trauma, you know, generational trauma, and how oppression sort of persists and reproduces in our systems, and how that shows up in our lives. And if we're experiencing ourselves in an oppressive circumstance, that is a state of subalternity. So I just want to make that term very clear before we move on. Subaltern leadership epistemologies is a term that I coined specifically for this study. Subaltern is not new, leadership is not new, epistemologies, which means knowledge, is not new. But I put it all together. Why? I wanted to be able to point out that leadership practice is not universal. It does not look one way. Your leadership practice comes from a certain place, and it comes from within. Regardless of what type of theory you want to apply to your own practice, it's still you with your historical circumstance bringing out what you need to bring out to succeed in your career. Okay, so that's why I coined the term subaltern leadership epistemologies. So in this study, I'm essentially asking two questions and needing to answer those two questions, right? So the first one is, what are the subaltern leadership epistemologies of Filipinx American administrative leaders in higher education? The second, what life experiences inform and influence the leadership epistemologies of Filipinx American administrative leaders in higher education? So I'm looking for the what is going on in their current practice, and how does their past inform what they do at their workplace? There's, of course, my role as the researcher, right? So if you're doing doctoral level research, you really need to look at your own positionality, what's called your positionality. What is my position in this research so that the data that I find is completely valid and unobscured by me? Well, my role as the researcher is I am a first-generation immigrant from the Philippines. I'm Filipinx administrative leader in higher education as well. I have intimacy with the cultural nuances of Filipino culture. So one could say, well, would that be a biased situation? And the answer is no. The answer is no, because number one, when you're doing research, you have to commit yourself to the ethics of research. I mentioned earlier that this was an in-depth qualitative research study that was phenomenological in nature. So phenomenology means that as a researcher, I have to, as much as I can, separate myself from my participants so that their voice can come through. So what I'm interpreting in the process of interviewing, which I haven't mentioned yet, is their participant voice. So really being committed to having that phenomenological disposition. It's sort of like a distancing so that I could be able to take all the information that's coming at me without applying my own lens. However, when it comes to intimacy with cultural nuances, then I can engage in culturally relevant research. Culturally relevant research provides justice to participants, especially if you're working with a specific ethnic group, right? So I use my background as a strength. I use my background as a Filipinx administrative leader in higher ed as a strength to pick up on things, sentences, words, phrases that could otherwise be ignored in another type of research study. Okay. Other commitments, situating this study within critical theories. So what I didn't do was go with like literature that talked about transformative leadership in education or grit or mindset theory. Those I see as universal, and also theories that come from non-oppressed peoples. I guess that's how I'll say it. And that was really important for me. So situating it within a critical theory, a critical lens, made it much more culturally relevant in my approach. All right, so I mentioned interviews once, qualitative research. What I did was recruit 6 participants. And for each participant, I conducted 3 interviews. The first interview was only focused on participant life history. And that covered, what was your immigration experience? What was your parents' immigration experience? How was schooling, early childhood? What were your experiences in high school? What kind of college preparatory advising did you receive? Moving into higher ed, how did that look like? Career trajectories, how did you end up there? That was interview 1. Approximately a week later, we would meet again for interview 2. And this is where we exclusively focused on just leadership practice. How do you operate? What does your week look like? Who reports to you? Who do you report to? Describe some of the communication. What are the challenges? How do you describe overcoming these challenges? And then another week later, interview 3, meaning making. So in interview 3, I'm really summarizing what was shared in the first 2 interviews and asking the participants to make their own connections. And throughout the interviews, what I've done in terms of analyzing the data was a lot of combing through and reading through all of the interview transcriptions. It was important for me to listen to the interview transcriptions as well, so I can hear their voice. I have to say there's a big difference between reading their text and hearing their voice, because they're actually emphasizing different things in their interviews. And so in terms of coding, I built a coding system to basically extract the data I needed to answer my research questions. So a little bit about my participants. I did my recruiting last September. It was a little bit difficult. There's not a whole host of Filipinx administrators, but through snowball sampling and that sort of thing, I was able to gather 6, 2 men, 4 women, 3 in senior level administrative positions, and these are all pseudonyms. These are all all of the roles are protected, but 3 senior level and 3 mid-level. The reason why I mixed senior and mid is because I couldn't find a study that started something like this. So I figured, okay, since I'm starting something like this, I'll do a mix of senior and mid-level administrative leaders, and also a mix of men and women as well. So we have here Carlos, a vice chancellor, Dolores, VP of Student Affairs, Lourdes, a provost, Eloy, director of enrollment, Lucia, director of advising, and then Ida, senior director of student life. I also had to do a portion in my dissertation to describe the difference between managers and leaders. And I do come from the perspective that no matter your managerial level, that you are performing leadership. And I was able to find a whole host of literature with regard to that. So a little bit about the data with regard to my participants. After all the coding, interviewing, and everything, there was something here that I think you'll notice already that popped out really strongly and early on in my analysis, and that's the word harmony. And so behind what you'll see in the third column, core themes, you'll see 5 words for the core themes for each person. Behind those core themes were a whole host of coding, extensive, I would say. But for example, I was able to grab what the individual leadership epistemology was, for example, for Carlos. His core themes were harmony, relational trust, community, authenticity, and equity-mindedness. And so what I did with that is coin one term to describe him as an administrative leader and how he carries that out. He ended up with harmonious inclusivity. Carlos is a first-generation Filipino immigrant. He witnessed a lot of segregation in his high school, a lot of busing Black and brown students into his high school, a lot of social unrest. And it wasn't until his college years, when he was finally exposed to ethnic studies, that he realized he had an identity. And this was way into his young adulthood. And that spurred on with him sort of this need to move further and be in a role to provide justice for all types of students to have the same access to the same type of education. Carlos also, when he graduated high school, he wasn't aware of what 4-year colleges were. He was advised to go straight into community college and didn't know what transferring to a university meant until he accidentally crossed a recruiting table at his community college. So that is Carlos's experience. I could go through all of them. I'm afraid I would go over the hour, but let me see if I could quickly go through the participants. Dolores leads with harmonious partnership. She grew up faced with a lot of instances of racism and colorism growing up. It affected her greatly. And she was a rebel in college. She also, at some point in her career, realized that a career in higher education, she could marry critical theory with practice. And so instead of being a rebel and pushing and protesting and activism, ironically enough, her main strength is creating partnership. So when she's challenged with something, she reaches out to that person that's challenging her and asks for a partnership. Her themes are harmony, equity-minded, mobilizer, connector, and fearlessness. I remember asking her, how she handles her tough days. And her answer was, rarely do I ever feel knocked down. So that's Dolores. Lourdes, I remember her as a marathon runner, harmonious efficiency. Her main focus was to keep everyone on the same page and sort of running with her, and at the same time making sure that the environment around her was completely harmonious and running efficiently. Really quickly, Eloy, harmonious coaching. Also, fearlessness was a strong running theme for Eloy. He based and used the word harmony a lot in his in the interviews, but he based a lot of his approach to employees as a family and as a team, and empowering folks to let them know that you're not alone. Not only are you not alone in your work, but any action that you take and any risk that you take will affect the entire team. And so what was really important for him was to teach his team about adaptability and fairness and the same kind of fearlessness he had. Lucia, harmonious nurturance. She was also focused on team harmony, but in a wellness kind of way. And so she was really big on having one-on-ones with her staff to sort of elicit and get to know them and get to know what their passions are and get to know how to protect her staff as best as she could, seeing them as a family as well. Ida, finally, harmonious engagement, very diligent, very courageous, very much critical in her inquiry. She's all about connection. She's all about cross partnerships, co-collaboration. And when she's faced with a challenge, question at all about her approach, she tends to ask questions back. And so she's interesting because she loves engagement. And when she's challenged, she turns that engagement all the way up. So that's Ida. All right, so back to my research questions. And it was important for me to get those individual leadership epistemologies, but equally important to see what were some of the patterns across all of the participants, because it was very clear to me and I was seeing it very early on. So research question 1, as a reminder, what are the subaltern leadership epistemologies of Filipinx American leaders in higher ed? So I came up with 3 emergent themes: organizational harmony, community and togetherness, and managing subalternity. If you remember the definition of subalternity, it's that being in an oppressive circumstance, but managing that. So I picked up a lot on how administrators, the participants in the studies, had to manage those sorts of circumstances. There was a good amount of managing subalternity, equally as important as organizational harmony and community and togetherness. Research question 2, what were the life experiences that inform and influence these current day practices? The emergent themes that came through were shared family care and community, lack of educational advising, and again, subalternity and epiphanic identity development. Epiphanic is a fancy word, I realize, but that third theme is all about, what were the challenges in my life and how did that form my identity? How did it crystallize and make me move forward and push on? Okay. So I wanted to also provide in my data analysis which emergent themes from my first research question were aligned with the theme in the second research question, right? So organizational harmony and community and togetherness. Let's talk about what that is first. Organizational harmony was a highly held professional aim, value, and disposition, I would say, before any institutional aims. Before any institutional aims, these professionals wanted to make sure that their environments were collegial and functional, efficient, and engaged in dialogue. Okay, so that meant if there was any hierarchy, there was an attempt to flatten that, right? So that you can have community and more togetherness. Orchestrating spaces to encourage harmonious understanding, communication and partnership, advocacy for inclusive programming, trying to create momentum for change, certainly staff development and coaching, peak performance, and lateral and vertical critical engagement. And that leads into community and togetherness, which is sort of like, I saw it as the apparatus for bringing in harmony into the institution. So treating professional spaces like a family, garnishing partnerships, building community, deep connections, uniting team mindset, engaging in more cross collaboration in ways that haven't been done in the past, empowering direct reports, empowering staff, and fostering a collective work culture. So there was a lot of, besides meetings and the administrative work, there were a lot of sharing of, what are the social activities? How do I get to know my teams? How do I get to know other offices? So a lot of using social practices to garner partnerships. So these things, the participants attributed to their past the theme of shared family care and community. A lot of what was shared had to do with having a past where there was a second mom, parents were working all the time, parents were not available for them, they had siblings as parents, they witnessed family members being advisors to new immigrant families. They witnessed family members opening up their homes to other families newly immigrating, living in their homes, remembering nothing but joy and love, even with not so much space in the home, but seeing how that built relationship and care and concern for the other first. So witnessing, being, I don't want to say being of service, being there, being present, witnessing being present for an other first, for the aim of making a very harmonious sort of family. So this slide, managing subalternity. So none of the participants were immune from oppressive experiences, such as imposter syndrome, sexism, racism, model minority stereotypes. Colorism was a big deal, and racial battle fatigue. This was a strong emergent theme with all the participants. They applied what I called internal and external applications to manage these experiences. So there was a certain amount of effort to retain personal identity and their own values, what it meant to code switch. There were half of the participants talked about feeling the need to code switch, but then deciding along their career not to do it again, because it compromised them. It compromised their identity. Analyzing organizational dynamics was also part of managing subalternity, personal growth work, and extended networks and what's called chosen families. Having a family outside your own that can understand what your professional struggles are. External applications, taking an anti-racist stance in the profession, being that advocate, encouraging partnerships, actively establishing their own credentials, actively, like, hi, I'm here, I'm not a student. Yes, I have a doctorate degree, or yes, I have an education. Yes, I am the director of so-and-so or the provost, always having to validate themselves, self-advocacy, and again, not code switching. The management of these experiences persist as a requirement for administrative leadership, according to my participants. And so this emergent theme was tied to subalternity in the past and identity development, and also lack of educational advising. So there's, within subaltern studies, there's a lot of talk about colonial systems and how it affects the way a group of colonized people will think. And there's a term called colonial mentality. There was a lot of experiences from the participants that talked about, you know, when I was growing up, I didn't know better, but I would think if I were more like, if I had lighter skin, if I were white, my life would be easier. I would be accepted more. Because I'm different, I know I'm being treated differently and unfairly. At the same time, specifically for Filipino culture, and this is likely with other cultures as well, colorism and valuing whiteness is a thing. It's a generational, some could call it a generational curse. It's a generational thing. One of the participants shared that her mom would offer her skin whitening soap to sort of, quote, better her chances in life. Lack of Asian leadership representation. A lot of the participants talked about, well, I didn't know I could do the job that I could do because I didn't see anyone like me in those positions. Okay. Another part of identity development is a large portion of the participants really turned once they entered a course in college that was about Asian American studies, social justice, ethnic studies, and democracy. And so that's what sort of validated their identity and helped them to move forward. Giving back what was lost. And so in their road towards their career development, being able to find opportunities where, okay, you know, I didn't have this sort of thing, and I could be in this role now to be in a position to provide access to other marginalized students. Lack of educational advising was a strong theme. There was a lack of educational advising. Lack of college-bound advising. I want to summarize this part by saying Filipinx Americans get caught within the model minority myth. And so they get ensnared by it. They get caught in it. How? Well, the model minority stereotype says you're fine. You should be smart. You're gonna fare out well in life. So great. So imagine that being applied to you, and then at the same time really needing academic support. But because the model minority myth works systemically and gets reproduced systemically as an ideology, then we end up with educational institutions that do not provide proper advisement to certain ethnic groups. And so that's how they sort of get caught. How did the participants handle this? Well, they depended on community support or just luck. I had one participant that his parents were too busy to even know or talk about college. The school didn't, but he had one friend with a family member that said, hey, you want to come along and visit college campuses? So that was his way. Implications of my study, there are many, but I do want to have time to answer some of your questions. I have a column here in the first section, educational sorting, where I talk about how educational systems must question critically their own power in how they impact students' racialized experiences and perspectives about their college and career paths. Okay, critical studies, embedding more critical studies in K through 12 and also higher education, ethnic studies, Asian American studies. My participants didn't know themselves. They weren't quite sure their historical circumstance until they were able to take an elective, mind you, in their college career, young adulthood. Nurture development of leaders. Certainly, we have always a new generation of higher ed leaders coming into these critical spaces, these spaces where higher ed leaders are the ones making those decisions for institutions. And so having that culturally relevant professional development is important, I think. Establishing disaggregate data. And so this addresses AAPI students at large. While there are strength in numbers and we do need to represent and advocate for each other, being that the AAPI is represented by over 40 ethnic Asian groups, it's hard to tell where there might be a grave problem. And then it becomes easy to sort of miss out on an opportunity to provide proper service. Finally, the model minority myth, which I talked about a little bit, and institutions looking for ways to try and dismantle that damaging stereotype. So I think we went to discussions and questions now. I want to thank you again for listening to me, and I guess we are going to open it up. Okay.
Hi, Tricia. I'm not sure we have any questions. So maybe if anybody wants to jump in and start a discussion, go ahead and raise your hand and we can unmute you.
I see something here from Michelle Weller. Could you talk a little bit more about code switching? Sure. The participants that talked about code switching talked about how tiring it was, how fake it felt, how different of a culture it seemed like for one particular participant when walking into a room, how she felt like she had to transform and change the way she sounded because she thought she would be accepted more at that level. Finally, she hit a wall and decided not to do that, just to relax and be her genuine self. She didn't feel like it was fair to her. Another participant described code switching as a way of being disingenuous to yourself. And so it was hard for him to sort of go back to what his genuine opinions were with regard to whatever meeting might have been, but really just being himself, and a way of that being a way to ask his folks in his environment to accept him and the way he shows up as differently to be accepted. And code switching, if you're not familiar with the term, code switching is a general term that has to do with the way one presents themselves. And depending on what kind of environment you're in, whether or not you walk into that room and change the way that you speak, your mannerisms, so that it matches the majority group. So that's code switching.
And I think we do have a couple questions in the Q&A.
Okay. I have, are the participants in your research mentoring others? Some of them are. Certainly the senior leaders, there's a stark difference. Yes, the senior leaders are, and they mentioned how they do and are available to mentor others and are quite passionate about that. The mid-level leaders, not so much. The second question is, can you be a mentor, or can we contact you to speak at DEI events? Of course. Yes, absolutely. This is a work in progress, and it's a different way to talk about diversity in higher education. There's something weird going on in higher ed right now. I don't know. I've been sort of ignoring some of the negative news. And you'll see where I stand here, but there have been, I'm hearing groups, I don't know if they're institutions, that are trying to urge higher education to step away from critical race theory, trying to put a bad light on it. And so that's dangerous, because then it discourages the types of activities where we can garnish more rich and diverse perspectives, right? There's not only Filipinx leaders, there's a whole host of other diverse backgrounds for which we need to learn from. If we are to be those that institute inclusivity in higher education, it would be great if the leaders themselves can learn from each other and tolerate differences amongst each other. So that's happening right now. And yeah, that would be great. You can contact me. It's awesome. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Can you please share some ways in which administrators can support AAPI students based on your research? How does this differ from, okay. Yeah, you know, I do believe in incremental steps. And I urge everyone to listen to the language of your institution. What is the shared language that administrators have on your campus? It is indicative of what your campus is ready for. What is the language that is used when talking about AAPI students? Once you open your ears to that, it will become pretty clear. The folks that curtail that language, you will probably see clear power dynamics. So I think that's a first great step. Looking at the data at your campus, because it will tell you a story. Data is supposed to give you a story. If your data about AAPI students is not giving you any story at all, then it's likely the case that you need to look at how you're pulling that data with regard to AAPI students. Usually the case is they take the data with regard to AAPI and generalize it to all students. And taking it into account your local region and local demographics as well, because that's going to vary as well. Let's see. Very interesting. As a Vietnamese American, I found a lot of similarities in my own journey, higher education at Northridge. Yes, absolutely. I'm glad that we connected there. Am I missing any other question? Okay, institution types. 4-year institutions, and there was one 2-year institution, participant from a 2-year institution, mostly from California, one from Hawaii. Again, recruiting was very difficult, and the aim was to capture participants from across the nation, although I did not end up getting there.
And I think we have a couple more in the Q&A as well.
Okay. No, I think I answered these ones. Okay. I have to say, completing a doctorate, which a lot of you may have done. If you haven't, I encourage it. It is a challenging endeavor, especially if you're working full time. But if there's something stirring within you with regard to higher ed and your practice, and you want to be able to investigate that and provide at any level expertise, you already have it. The programs just tease it out of you. I encourage going for it. However, from my experience, I did have to make sure I had a network of support and folks, family and friends that were willing and able to support me in certain ways so I can get through it. I'm not seeing any other new questions, Anita.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that you got them all.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me again. And I do look forward to interfacing with the rest of AACRAO and continuing conversations that have to do with diversity and leadership.
Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much, Tricia. This was really, really outstanding. And definitely thank you so much for sharing your experience and your research.
Awesome. Thank you.